On November 22, 1943, a mining engineer stood atop a Japanese fortress that had already killed dozens of Marines, directing fire while enemy soldiers climbed toward him with bayonets. Within minutes he would be dead, but the bunker would fall, and the United States Marine Corps would never assault a fortified position the same way again. This is the story of how one man's refusal to follow doctrine changed the outcome of a battle, influenced an entire war, and was then forgotten for 70 years until his bones were finally brought home. The island of Beachhead, part of Tarawa Atoll in the Gilbert Islands, measured less than 3 miles long and 800 yards across at its widest point. On a map it resembled a parrot's beak jutting into the Pacific, so small that you could walk its perimeter in under an hour if you weren't being shot at. But in November 1943, this insignificant scratch of coral and sand had become the most heavily fortified piece of real estate per square foot in the entire Pacific theater. The Japanese had spent more than a year turning it into what their commander, Rear Admiral Keiji Shibasaki, confidently declared could not be taken by 1,000,000 men in 100 years. He had 5,000 troops, most of them elite Rikusentai naval infantry, alongside Korean laborers who had built a defensive network so sophisticated it made previous island fortifications look primitive by comparison. Concrete bunkers reinforced with steel rails and coconut logs. Interlocking fields of fire, tetrahedrons and barbed wire choking the lagoon approaches, artillery pre-sighted on every beach, and at the center of the island's western defenses, dominating the critical Red Beach 1 sector, stood what Marines would come to call simply the Strongpoint, a reinforced bunker complex so large and so deadly that it would claim more American lives than any other single position on Beachhead. The United States needed Tarawa as an airbase to support the drive toward the Marshall Islands, then the Marianas, then eventually Japan itself. The strategic logic was clean and simple on planning maps back in Hawaii. The execution would prove anything but simple. The assault began before dawn on November 20, 1943, with what seemed like overwhelming force. The 2nd Marine Division, supported by naval gunfire that turned the sky orange and shook the island like an earthquake. For hours, battleships and cruisers pounded Beachhead with shells that should have obliterated everything above ground. Carrier aircraft followed with bombs and rockets. Marines watching from transport ships were told the bombardment would leave nothing alive, that they would walk ashore and find only corpses and craters. Some officers even worried there would be nothing left to fight. They were catastrophically wrong. When the first wave of Marines hit the reef in their Higgins boats, they discovered the tide was lower than predicted, far too shallow for the flat-bottomed landing craft to cross the coral barrier. Men had to climb out and wade 700 yards through chest-deep water, while Japanese machine guns, miraculously untouched by the bombardment, opened up from reinforced positions. It was murder on an industrial scale. Marines fell in the water and didn't get up. Others made it to the seawall only to find themselves pinned down by fire so intense that raising your head meant death. The carefully orchestrated assault plan disintegrated within the first hour. Units landed in the wrong places, lost their officers, became isolated. The beach became a slaughterhouse, and the slaughterhouse became a stalemate. For 3 days this continued. Marines pushed forward yard by yard, bunker by bunker, dying in quantities that shocked even the most experienced commanders. Some positions fell to flamethrowers, others to satchel charges, still others to point-blank artillery fire. But one position refused to fall. The Strongpoint on Red Beach 1 remained intact, dominating the beach and blocking any advance inland. It was massive, perhaps 60 feet long, constructed from thick coconut logs covered with coral sand, and then more logs in multiple layers, creating a structure that could absorb direct hits from naval shells without collapsing. The Japanese had built it with calculated genius, multiple firing ports covering every approach, ventilation systems to keep the interior breathable during attacks, storage for ammunition and water, sleeping quarters for the garrison. Intelligence estimates suggested approximately 150 Japanese soldiers occupied the complex, though exact numbers were impossible to determine because they rarely exposed themselves to observation. Standard Marine Corps doctrine for bunker assault involved a predictable sequence: suppress the enemy with machine gun and rifle fire, maneuver infantry close enough to throw grenades or place satchel charges, then finish with flamethrowers if available. This had worked on smaller positions across BTO. It failed completely against the Strongpoint. The concrete and log construction was too thick for grenades to penetrate. Satchel charges placed at firing ports killed some defenders but didn't collapse the structure. Flamethrowers could reach into openings but couldn't clear the entire interior. Every assault resulted in dead Marines and an intact bunker. Artillery fire from the beach, even at point-blank range, couldn't penetrate the roof. Naval gunfire couldn't be called that close to friendly forces. The Strongpoint had become a mathematical problem with no solution, and men kept dying while officers argued about what to do next. First Lieutenant Alexander Bonnyman Jr. arrived at this tactical deadlock on the afternoon of November 22, the third day of the battle. He was 23 years old, tall and thin, with a degree in mining engineering from Princeton and several years of practical experience working copper and zinc mines in the American Southwest before the war. He had enlisted in the Marine Corps after Pearl Harbor despite having flat feet that should have disqualified him, talked his way past the medical rejection, and ended up assigned to the 18th Marines, an engineer regiment. His official job involved shore party operations, logistics, unloading supplies, building roads, all the unglamorous infrastructure work that keeps an invasion functioning. He was not supposed to be in the front lines leading an assault, but Tarawa had consumed officers at a horrific rate, and the situation at Red Beach 1 had deteriorated so badly that anyone with explosives experience was being pulled forward to help. When Bonnyman reached the seawall and assessed the Strongpoint, he didn't see it the way an infantry officer would. He saw it as an engineering problem, specifically a ventilation and access problem. The bunker was essentially an artificial cave with multiple entrances and carefully designed air circulation. The Japanese defenders could retreat from one section to another when attacked, using interior passages to reposition and maintain their defense. As long as they could breathe and move freely inside their fortress, they could hold indefinitely. But caves have specific vulnerabilities that anyone who has worked underground understands. Seal the entrances, disrupt the air supply, introduce smoke and heat and pressure, and the occupants have two choices: evacuate or suffocate. The problem wasn't destroying the bunker from the outside. The problem was making the interior uninhabitable. Bonnyman began organizing what would become the final assault with the methodical patience of someone solving a complex problem, rather than the desperate urgency of someone trying to survive. He gathered Marines who had flamethrowers, Marines who had demolition charges, Marines who had nothing but rifles and grenades. He identified every entrance and firing port he could see from the seawall. He explained his plan in simple terms. They would attack simultaneously from multiple directions, not trying to penetrate the bunker but to seal it, to close every opening with flame and explosives, to create an environment inside that no human could survive. It would require precise coordination and extremely close-range work under heavy fire. It would probably result in significant casualties, but it would work. The assault began late in the afternoon, with the sun descending toward the western horizon and casting long shadows across the churned coral. Bonnyman led from the front, carrying demolition charges himself, directing Marines to specific positions with the calm authority of someone who understood exactly what needed to happen and in what sequence. Flamethrowers moved forward first. Their operators bent low, massive fuel tanks on their backs, making them priority targets for any Japanese riflemen with a clear line of sight. The first bursts of ignited fuel shot into firing ports. 30-foot streams of jellied gasoline that splashed into the bunker interior and turned confined spaces into ovens. The Japanese responded with rifle fire and grenades, but the intensity of the flame attack forced them deeper into the structure, away from the openings. While the flamethrowers worked, Bonnyman and other Marines rushed forward with satchel charges and thermite grenades, placing them at entrances and detonating them to collapse openings or block them with burning debris. The thermite was particularly effective, burning at temperatures that could melt steel and creating clouds of white smoke that filled the bunker's ventilation system. The noise was overwhelming, the roar of flamethrowers, the crack of rifle fire, the dull thump of explosives, men shouting orders and warnings. The air thickened with smoke and coral dust until visibility dropped to a few feet. Marines could barely see what they were shooting at, operating on instinct and training, and the desperate clarity that comes when you know that hesitation means death. The Japanese defenders, realizing their position was being systematically sealed, attempted several counterattacks. Small groups of soldiers rushed from the bunker's rear entrance, bayonets fixed, trying to disrupt the assault before their fortress became their tomb. This was where the attack reached its most desperate phase, the kind of close-quarters combat that dissolves into chaos, where you shoot at movement and hope it's not your own men. Bonnyman, positioned near the center of the action, killed at least 3 Japanese soldiers with his rifle at distances measured in yards, not hundreds of yards. Other Marines fought hand-to-hand, using knives and rifle butts and anything within reach. The defenders were brave and skilled and determined, but they were fighting in increasingly impossible conditions, breathing smoke, half-blind, their ammunition running low, their water gone. What happened next became the defining moment of the battle and of Bonnyman's short life. Rather than wait for the bunker to be completely sealed from ground level, he made the decision to climb onto the roof of the structure itself. This was tactically insane by conventional standards. The roof of the bunker was the most exposed position in the entire sector, visible to any Japanese soldier within rifle range, offering no cover whatsoever. But it also provided the perfect vantage point to observe the entire complex, to see which entrances were still active, to direct the final phase of the assault with precision. Bonnyman understood that warfare at this level wasn't about following doctrine. It was about solving problems faster than your enemy could adapt, and sometimes that meant accepting risks that no manual would recommend. He climbed. Other Marines followed him, 5 or 6 men scrambling up the coral sand slope onto the bunker's roof while bullets snapped past them and grenades detonated below. From this elevated position, Bonnyman could see Japanese soldiers attempting to evacuate through the rear entrance, could see where the flamethrower teams needed to redirect their fire, could coordinate the final demolition charges that would collapse the last accessible openings. He stood upright, gesturing to Marines below, his voice cutting through the noise with commands that were crisp and specific and completely calm. In the recollections of Marines who survived and witnessed this, they consistently described the same detail: his composure. While everything around him was chaos and violence and men dying, Bonnyman functioned with the focused intensity of an engineer solving a technical problem under time pressure, which is exactly what he was. The Japanese defenders still inside the bunker understood what was happening. They could see the American officer on their roof directing the attack. They could feel their fortress transforming into a trap. Several soldiers armed with rifles and grenades attempted to climb onto the roof from interior access points, trying to kill or drive off the Americans before the bunker was completely sealed. This led to fighting on top of the bunker itself, a surreal tableau of men shooting and stabbing each other while standing on the roof of a fortress that was being simultaneously burned and demolished beneath them. Bonnyman shot at least 2 Japanese soldiers who emerged near him. Another Marine was hit and rolled off the roof, falling 15 feet onto the coral. The air was thick with smoke now, making it hard to breathe, hard to see, hard to think clearly. And then Bonnyman was hit. A Japanese rifleman, firing from somewhere in the smoke and confusion, put a bullet into him. Then another. Witnesses gave conflicting accounts about the exact sequence. Some said he was hit multiple times in rapid succession. Others said he remained standing after the first shot and continued giving orders before falling. What is certain is that he died on that roof, probably within seconds or minutes of being hit, and his body remained there while the assault continued around him. Marines who had been following his commands kept working, kept sealing the bunker, kept fighting because stopping would mean his death accomplished nothing. Within 30 minutes of Bonnyman being killed, the Strongpoint was neutralized. The last entrances were sealed. Demolition charges collapsed the roof in several places. Marines poured fuel into any remaining openings and ignited it, creating an inferno inside that consumed oxygen and flesh. Some Japanese defenders died from the flames, others from smoke inhalation, others from the concussion of repeated explosions in confined spaces. A few attempted to surrender and were shot, not from cruelty, but because the situation was too chaotic and violent for anyone to process the distinction between a soldier attacking and a soldier yielding. When the bunker finally fell silent, and Marines cautiously entered the sections that were still accessible, they found bodies stacked in passages, men who had retreated as far as they could before the smoke and heat killed them. The tactical impact was immediate and decisive. With the Strongpoint eliminated, the entire Red Beach 1 sector opened up. Marines who had been pinned down for 3 days could advance inland. Artillery could be moved forward to support further attacks. Supplies could be brought across the beach without constant interdiction from bunker fire. The balance of the battle, which had been uncertain and costly, shifted firmly in American favor. Within 24 hours, organized Japanese resistance on Beachhead would cease, though small groups of defenders fought to the death, and the final casualty count would shock American newspapers and radio audiences. But the Strongpoint's fall was the turning point, and everyone involved understood that. The cost of taking Tarawa was staggering. Of the 5,000 Japanese and Korean defenders, only 17 Japanese soldiers and 129 Koreans survived to be captured. Everyone else died. On the American side, approximately 1,000 Marines were killed and twice that number wounded in 76 hours of fighting. These casualty rates were unprecedented in the Pacific War to that point, far exceeding what planners had anticipated, and they generated intense public controversy back in the United States. Photographs of dead Marines floating in the lagoon appeared in Life magazine and sparked congressional inquiries. Parents demanded to know why their sons had died taking an island most Americans couldn't find on a map. Military strategists debated whether the lessons learned justified the cost in blood. Among those lessons was the realization that fortified positions couldn't be neutralized with artillery and air bombardment alone, that bunkers built with sufficient engineering skill required specialized assault techniques, and that conventional infantry tactics often failed against unconventional defenses. Bonnyman's method of systematically sealing a bunker, rather than trying to penetrate it, became studied and replicated. Marine Corps training incorporated specific doctrine for dealing with hardened positions using coordinated flamethrower and demolition attacks. Engineers became more integrated into assault planning, their technical expertise valued alongside tactical knowledge. When Marines landed at Saipan, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa, they used refined versions of techniques that Bonnyman had improvised under fire at Tarawa. First Lieutenant Alexander Bonnyman Jr. was awarded the Medal of Honor posthumously. The citation described his conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty, and detailed his actions on November 22, 1943. His family received the medal in a ceremony in Washington. His widow, Frances, eventually remarried, though she never stopped telling their children about their father. Alexander Bonnyman's name was added to the list of American heroes from World War II, mentioned in Histories of Tarawa, included in Marine Corps institutional memory, alongside other recipients of the nation's highest military decoration. But his body remained on Beachhead. After the battle, American Graves Registration units collected and identified as many dead as possible, but the chaos of combat and the condition of many remains made this work difficult and incomplete. Some Marines were buried in temporary cemeteries on the island, others in mass graves. Still others left where they fell because retrieving them under fire was impossible. Bonnyman's body was initially buried on Beachhead in a cemetery near the beach, grave number 175. After the war, the remains in that cemetery were transferred to a larger American cemetery on Hawaii, then years later repatriated to the continental United States for burial in permanent military cemeteries. Except that during one of these transfers, Bonnyman's remains were either mislabeled or commingled with others, and what was thought to be Alexander Bonnyman Jr. turned out to be someone else. His actual body, along with dozens of other Marines, remained buried in a mass grave on Beachhead that was eventually lost to records, covered over, forgotten as the island returned to civilian life and vegetation, reclaimed the battlefield. For 70 years, the Bonnyman family didn't know where Alexander's actual remains were. They had a headstone in a military cemetery, but it marked an empty grave. They had the Medal of Honor citation, photographs, letters, memories passed down through generations. But they didn't have him. The island of Beachhead became part of the independent nation of Kiribati, and the battlefields became covered with homes and businesses and the ordinary infrastructure of civilian life. Japanese bunkers remained visible, converted into storage sheds, or simply left as concrete monuments to an almost forgotten fight. The mass graves, however, were unmarked and unknown. In 2010, a private organization called History Flight, dedicated to recovering American service members from Pacific battlefields, began working on Beachhead with the permission of the Kiribati government. They used ground-penetrating radar, archaeological techniques, interviews with elderly islanders who remembered the battle, and careful analysis of wartime maps and photographs. In 2013, 70 years after the battle, they excavated a mass grave and discovered the remains of approximately 36 Marines. Forensic anthropologists and DNA analysis eventually identified one set of remains as belonging to First Lieutenant Alexander Bonnyman Jr., confirmed by matching dental records and DNA samples from his surviving daughter. On September 27, 2015, Alexander Bonnyman Jr. was buried with full military honors at the National Memorial Cemetery of the Pacific in Honolulu, the same cemetery where many of his fellow Marines from Tarawa are interred. His daughter, Alexandra Bonnyman Jr., then in her 70s, attended the ceremony along with dozens of extended family members, Marine Corps representatives, and veterans from subsequent wars who came to honor a man whose innovation and sacrifice they had been taught about in training. The ceremony included a rifle salute, taps, and the presentation of the flag to his daughter. After 72 years, Alexander Bonnyman Jr. had finally come home. The story of Tarawa and the Strongpoint on Red Beach 1 raises uncomfortable questions about military innovation and institutional learning. How many lives could have been saved if Bonnyman's engineering approach had been standard doctrine from the beginning, instead of something improvised under fire? Why did it take a civilian mining engineer to solve a problem that career military officers couldn't? What does it say about military institutions that they often resist innovation until crisis forces adaptation? These aren't abstract historical questions. They're patterns that repeat in every war, in every military, in every organization that must balance tradition with effectiveness. Bonnyman's actions also illuminate something fundamental about leadership under pressure. He wasn't the highest-ranking officer in his sector. He wasn't the most experienced Marine on that beach. He was simply someone who saw a problem differently because of knowledge he brought from outside the military system, and who had the courage and clarity to act on that different perspective while bullets were flying and men were dying around him. This combination of technical expertise and personal courage is rare and valuable, and military organizations spend enormous resources trying to cultivate it in their officers. But Bonnyman didn't learn it at officer candidate school or in field training exercises. He learned it in mines and on construction sites, places where problems didn't care about your rank or your training, only whether your solution actually worked. The cost of this kind of leadership is often death. Bonnyman knew that climbing onto that bunker roof was likely suicidal. He did it anyway because the tactical situation required it, because his men needed that vantage point to finish the job, because sometimes leadership means accepting risks that you wouldn't ask anyone else to take. This isn't the Hollywood version of heroism, where the hero survives against impossible odds. This is the grimmer, more common reality, where doing the right thing at the right moment means you don't get to see how it turns out. Bonnyman directed the destruction of the Strongpoint, but didn't live to know that his actions changed how the Marine Corps would fight for the rest of the war. He died not knowing whether the bunker would actually fall, or whether his plan would work, or whether his name would be remembered. All he knew was that men were dying, and he had an idea that might work, and he was willing to die testing it. The Japanese defenders in that bunker were also human beings making impossible choices. They fought with extraordinary courage for a cause that history would judge harshly, following orders to hold a position that could not be held, dying to delay an invasion that couldn't be stopped. They deserve recognition as soldiers who did their duty under horrific conditions, even as we acknowledge the larger context of imperial aggression and atrocity that characterized Japan's war in the Pacific. The Strongpoint on Red Beach 1 was both their fortress and their tomb, a testament to engineering skill and tactical discipline that ultimately meant nothing except a few extra hours for their side and a few hundred more casualties for ours. War has this quality of rendering extraordinary human effort meaningless in strategic terms, while remaining absolutely meaningful to the individuals involved. The Battle of Tarawa and the innovation that Bonnyman brought to it had consequences that extended far beyond the Gilbert Islands. When American forces assaulted Iwo Jima in February 1945, they faced defensive complexes that made Tarawa's Strongpoint look simple. Miles of underground tunnels, bunkers with 3-foot-thick concrete walls, artillery positions that could be rolled out of caves, fired, and then hidden again before counter-battery fire could locate them. But the Marines who landed on those black sand beaches had been trained in the techniques refined from Tarawa. They knew to attack bunkers systematically, to use flamethrowers and demolitions in coordinated fashion, to think like engineers rather than just infantry. The battle still cost nearly 7,000 American dead and 19,000 wounded, but the doctrine that evolved from Bonnyman's improvisation saved uncountable lives by providing a framework for attacking positions that seemed impregnable. This pattern of civilian expertise solving military problems appears throughout history, though it's often undervalued or forgotten. The British engineers who invented specialized tanks for clearing mines and obstacles before D-Day were dismissed by conventional officers as eccentric or obsessed with impractical gadgets, until those gadgets saved thousands of lives on Normandy beaches. The computer scientists and mathematicians at Bletchley Park who broke German codes were mostly civilians with no military training, yet their work shortened the war in Europe by perhaps 2 years. The Manhattan Project physicists who built the atomic bomb were academics who had never worn uniforms. Military institutions are essential and honorable, but they can become rigid, bound by doctrine and tradition in ways that prevent them from seeing solutions that seem obvious to outsiders with different knowledge frameworks. Bonnyman represented this outsider perspective made suddenly relevant by war. He hadn't spent years learning Marine Corps doctrine or studying previous amphibious assaults. He had learned how to move earth and rock, how to shore up tunnels that might collapse, how to ventilate underground spaces, how to control where air and water flowed in confined systems. When confronted with a fortified bunker, he saw pipes and pressure and access points, the same problems he dealt with in mines, except with the added complication that people inside were trying to kill him. His solution worked because it addressed the actual physical reality of the situation, rather than relying on doctrinal approaches that assumed different conditions. The recovery of Bonnyman's remains 7 decades after his death adds another dimension to his story. The forensic archaeology required to identify him from commingled skeletal remains in a tropical environment was extraordinarily difficult, requiring expertise in biological anthropology, DNA analysis, historical research, and patient negotiation with foreign governments. The fact that private organizations like History Flight have taken on this mission speaks to something important about how societies honor their war dead. Official military efforts to recover and identify remains continue, but they're necessarily limited by budget and priorities. Private groups motivated by family connections, historical interest, or simple conviction that no fallen service member should be left behind have filled gaps that government bureaucracy cannot address. This creates ethical questions about whether recovery efforts should depend on private funding, whether some families get closure while others don't based on which cases volunteers choose to pursue, whether all the dead have equal claim on national memory. For Alexandra Bonnyman Jr, who was 5 months old when her father died, the recovery and reburial provided a form of closure that most families of the missing never receive. She grew up with a father who was simultaneously present and absent, his name on a Medal of Honor citation, his photographs on the wall, his story told and retold, but no grave to visit, no physical place where memory could be anchored. The ceremony in 2015 gave her and her extended family what they needed: acknowledgement that Alexander Bonnyman Jr. had served and sacrificed, that his remains would be treated with dignity, that his story would continue to be remembered as part of the larger narrative of American military history. The question of why we remember certain individuals and forget others is never simple or entirely fair. Hundreds of Marines performed acts of extraordinary courage on Tarawa. Many died doing their duty in ways just as brave as Bonnyman. But his story endures partly because of the Medal of Honor, partly because his civilian expertise made his contribution unique, and partly because the recovery of his remains, so many decades later, generated renewed interest in his life and death. Memory is selective and constructed, shaped by what serves current needs as much as by what actually happened. Bonnyman's story serves multiple purposes. It honors individual sacrifice, it illustrates the value of innovation in warfare, it provides a case study in military leadership, and it reassures contemporary Americans that their nation still cares about recovering its fallen even after many decades have passed. If you've listened this far, you understand that the story of Alexander Bonnyman Jr. is about more than one man's courage on one island in one battle. It's about how organizations learn and adapt, about the tension between expertise and hierarchy, about the cost of innovation and the price of leadership. It's about how wars are actually won, not just through firepower and numbers, but through individuals who see problems differently and have the courage to act on those insights. And it's about how we remember, how we honor, how we try to make sense of violence and sacrifice long after the battles are finished and the participants are dead. Please subscribe to this channel if you found this story valuable. Hit the like button to help others discover these histories that deserve to be remembered. And leave a comment sharing your thoughts, particularly on this question. In modern warfare with increasingly complex technology and specialized knowledge, how can military institutions better integrate civilian expertise without compromising command structure and discipline? How do we balance tradition with innovation when lives depend on getting that balance right? I'd genuinely like to know what you think, so please share your perspective in the comments. Thank you for listening to this story. Thank you for remembering Alexander Bonnyman Jr. and the thousands of others who fought and died on that small island 80 years ago. Their sacrifice and their ingenuity matter, even now, especially now, when the lessons they taught us about courage and creativity under pressure remain as relevant as ever.